Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Michael Sandler, your host on Inspire Nation. If you've ever wanted to find greater success without selling out, then do we have the Miracle of a Definite Chief Aim show for you. Today I'll be talking with Mitch Horowitz, a leader in the New Thought movement, PEN Award-winning historian, the author of The Miracle Club and the Napoleon Hill Success Course series, which includes the Miracle of a Definite Chief Aim and one simple idea. And that's just what I want to talk with him about today, about how to find the success you're looking for without selling out. That plus we'll talk about Steve Ditko and Spider-Man, the Fight Club and the Art of War, boxing and Mitch Horowitz, who in the world is Mr. A, and what in the world Satan's honor roll has to do with anything. So welcome back to the show, Mitch. Are you ready to shine?
Yes, delighted. Thank you. I love the litany of topics. I can't wait to hear what happens.
We are going to have fun today, but before we begin, I've asked a lot of interesting questions when I've started the show, Mitch, but I've never asked anything even close to this. Before we dive right into things, Mitch, what in the world does Satanism have to do with anything?
Oh, wow. You're cutting right to it, my man. Well, I have been exploring over the past 2 years of my life a very radically different interpretation of what is traditionally understood as Satanism. And I view the so-called satanic in the same way that it was viewed by the Romantic poets and playwrights and philosophers, which is a force of not violence or maleficence, not anything close, but a force of usurpation, rebellion, revolution, artistry, individual heroism. And I think this force has always existed in our world. It's gone under different names, whether it's called Shiva, Kali, Prometheus, Lucifer, Satan, Set, you name it. There's always been within our mythologies and parables and thought systems an idea of an adversarial opposing force that comes not to inflict but to liberate, not to impose but to usurp. And when you begin to experiment with rigorously alternative or independent philosophies, there's no moral code that automatically attaches itself to a movement that doesn't have a dogma or a doctrine. And it makes it all the more urgent for the individual to have his or her own moral code, including one that might be very informed by history and classical ethics, but that doesn't come ready-made, prepackaged, and barcode stamped for you. So I wrote an article to respond directly to your question called Satan's Honor Roll, which is published at Medium, where I devise a list of hardcore ethics, a code of honor, a code of reciprocity for the person who finds him or herself on a path that is dramatically and radically outside of the traditional. So I would encourage people to forget about vocabulary words, to forget about things that we have been conditioned through entertainment or just through a kind of general conventional dialogue to attach to different terms, and throwing out the vocabulary sheet, take a look at what I've written in Satan's Honor Roll, and it will represent to you my effort to come up with a really serious, road-tested, practical code of honor, code of ethics that isn't attached to any of the conventional spiritual paths.
So you just covered more than we could cover even in an entire interview. We are going to go through this list in a bit here.
We're done.
Yes, yeah. But what I find fascinating is, in essence, at this time of great change, do we all want to follow a path that is outside of the traditional path and find our own internal ethics?
That is a wonderful question, and it's entirely dependent upon what's most operative for the individual. If an individual identifies with one of the historic faiths, whether it be Buddhism or Judaism or Catholicism or Islam, and finds within those historic faiths a code of ethics that is real, that is actionable, that is not catechism, but that is an honest roadmap to how you treat other people, how you meet a stranger at your gates, how you function, not in your own eyes, but in the eyes of others on the path of life, then I applaud that. But for me, it was necessary to self-devise that code because I didn't find one that was functional or that had the fullness of perspective that I was looking for within any of the mainstream faiths. And again, the measure of a code of honor is not how I feel about it, is not how I view myself, but is how others view me apropos of my claimed principles. So when I publish a code like that, I say, judge its functionality based on my conduct.
Thank you.
And that's a decision that belongs to others.
Are we missing? I can think back when I was in organized religion, maybe a couple decades ago, and there was a war coming about, and they were talking about how we needed this war to bring peace to the world. And to me, it made absolutely no sense. The concept war versus peace, nobody will ever convince me that that's right. However, are we missing as a society or almost as a human species today, a honorable code of ethics?
There's no question that we are. There's absolutely no question that we are. I look around and I see people defending themselves based on what terms or labels or concepts they can attach themselves to. But the last place that they want to look is in their most immediate relationships. Spouses, boyfriends, girlfriends, best friends, coworkers. How would the people who are directly impacted by my behavior experience me? It doesn't matter what term I attach to myself. It doesn't matter what code of conduct I claim fealty to. It only matters whether other people around me feel that there's accountability, that there's loyalty, that there's solidarity, that there's appropriate support, that there's also an appropriate willingness to say no if I feel something is going off the rails or going wrong. It seems to me that, especially with the divide of social media, but this has always been true because it's just a facet of human nature, we love to thump our chests about what wonderful things we belong to or what we stand for, but it all comes down to what the people who are most immediately impacted by your life would say about you. I have two sons, ages 12 and 16. What would they say about me? What would their perspective be on my existence? What would the perspective be of people who are most immediately in my life? That's my code, regardless of what beautiful words I use.
So there's a term that I could use for this that Jessica and I have used in the past, or I've derived around where Jessica sees me or saw me, and I used to fail at this. It's called the donut test, which is I wrote barefoot running, wrote barefoot walking. Here I am, this great health advocate, and every once in a while, specifically on Maui, when we would drop off somebody at the airport, I would come back and stop and get a donut from Krispy Kreme. And she would say, you claim to be this great expert, but with me, you eat a Krispy Kreme donut. In other words, you are putting on one face to the world, and then you go and have your donut. And she taught me, very importantly, not only to share where I am truly at, but more importantly, that those closest to us are truly our mirrors. And if we're not treating them with the same nobility that we espouse to the rest of the world, we have some serious work to do.
Absolutely. And look, I think that the one test that governs every life, this is my Schrodinger's cat for ethics.
I love it.
This way. Okay. This is a thought experiment. If you were driving along some mountainous highway and it was snowing and your car went dead and your cell phone battery had run out and there was a pair of headlights coming down the road and flagging down the person behind that wheel, behind that pair of headlights was your one and only viable hope of receiving roadside assistance, who would you want it to be? Would you want it to be me? Or would you say never, never Mitch? Who would you want it to be? Who would you want to be behind that wheel? And when you're judging whether, or rather I should say, when you're measuring,
Yeah.
when you're measuring whether a relationship is going to be a viable one, a healthy one for you, ask yourself as plainly as possible whether you would want the individual to be the one behind that wheel. Because I can tell you that will reveal more than any number of quotations or citations or arguments. That is the Schrodinger's cat of ethics. And that is a thought experiment that we should dare not engage in apropos of ourselves unless we're prepared to be starkly honest. Because if you mislead yourself about that, you're misleading yourself and others around you about everything. So I would want to know, would people I work with, would Michael's listeners, would people who I know in my intimate life say, yes, I think I would want Mitch behind the wheel of that car. Or if they wouldn't, then maybe that puts me in front of a question.
I've got the jumper cables ready to go.
Right. Right.
But I mean, it is a great question, because particularly on some level, I don't get it. I always come back to, it was a good decade ago, an article came out on, oh no, I guess it wasn't a decade ago, 5 or 6 years ago, NDE #2, how I almost died on the trails. And it was written up in the Boulder Daily Camera. And one of the first comments is, he should have been left for dead. I wish he had died. Was a comment put in the newspaper in regards to me, which I flip back around and I send that person tremendous love. But it speaks to the amount that we're hurting today, and speaks to the amount that we have lost our noble selves.
Oh, there's no question about that. We celebrate ignobility. We celebrate cynicism. We celebrate sarcasm. We condemn people who are idealistic, who are attempting to do their very best according to the oaths that they've maintained. I think that when people are dismembered, disattached from a sense of themselves as creative beings, a sense of themselves as beings who are within their own concentric circle of life, capable of creativity.
Disempowered,
but self-disempowered. When people are divorced from their own sense of themselves as creators, as generators, as producers, they look to substitute for that feeling of vitality through hostility, through violence. So the person who posted that comment about, gee, I wish Michael were left for dead on the mountain trail, that person can only derive a sense of vitality through hostility, through violence, verbal violence in this particular case. And I think that this is a global malady. When people feel a sense of inability to create, to produce, to generate, they substitute that nutritious, fortifying sense of actual existence for a false sense of life vested in humiliating and practicing violence of one kind or another against other individuals. And that's become the global malady. It's been true since time immemorial, but we get a better perspective on it nowadays because of digital communication, which is why digital communication is so shocking. It's not really that human nature has changed. Why would human nature have changed? It's that we have a closer lens on it, a 24/7 open mic night in which we can witness it. And it is unsettling.
Why are we disempowering ourselves so much today?
That's a wonderful question. And I'm not entirely sure. I suppose we start to buy into false feelings of life and come to confuse them with the thing itself. I mean, look, when you buy a Krispy Kreme donut, which is great, I mean,
we had on Dean Radin talking about how you can transmute the donut as well.
I must hear about that.
He
How do we transmute the donut? Now I'm going to play interviewer. How do we transmute the donut, Michael? That's much more
he
interesting.
said it's all about the energy that we bring to the donut. What is our relationship with the donut? How do we view the donut? And if we view the donut differently, then it doesn't have the same energy going in that it did before.
Now, my challenge to Dean, who I love and who I venerate, and who's been a real help to me, is then would the same be true, for example, of taking a drag on a cigarette? I mean, is he really saying that we can biologically neutralize the potential harm that a cigarette might do?
Now, my guess, I can only surmise here. My guess is he would actually say yes, that it is all energy. And on some level, if your skills are there or your state is there, that yes, you could transmute the cigarette as well. Now, there is some science actually that's interesting on this, which is there are long-term studies. I think there was like a Harvard study going back to the 30s that looked at people taking drags on cigarettes versus people who had people who took drag on cigarettes and had a lot of friends around them versus people who did not smoke on cigarettes but did not have many friends. And the people who lived longer were the ones who had the close ties. Now, I realize that's secondary at best, but it does suggest that there is at least an antidote. Now, people are going, I got a lot of friends, go get me myself a pack. That's not quite what I'm saying.
But I'll act on it that way. No, no, I'm very intrigued by what you're saying, and I'm going to ask Dean about this, and we'll talk about this in a future show because we've discussed the question of sex transmutation, and that's a wonderful topic that always bears re-examination. But can we add to that the possibility of other forms of transmutation? And I will huddle with Dean about that. Now, apropos of your question,
I've got to say, just as would it be then, what in the world the Wachowski brothers, cigarettes, and transmuting donuts has to do with anything?
Exactly. I intend to call Dean and say, Michael Sandler says, you said I can smoke. We'll see what Dean says.
No, I'm in so much trouble. We better have him back on here as well.
Right. I'm calling him right now. And no, I do want to follow up with Dean on that question, and I will be delighted to report back to you and your listeners what grows out of that conversation. But to respond to your question, my sense is, quite frankly, that escapism does bring a temporary pleasure, and we grow addicted in one way or another to that temporary pleasure. So whether it's debt spending or smoking or drugs or whatever, watching the Home Shopping Network or gambling or whatever, we do grow very attached to repeat behaviors that provide temporary escapist thrills. And unfortunately, like all things that we do in life, there's a polarity, and the thing that makes us feel good exists down the scale, so to speak, from a polarity that's also profoundly depressing, unhelpful, and promoting of a certain kind of dependency. So I think these things all come to substitute for perhaps the one experience which is free from polarity, which is a sense of awareness and creativity. I think probably our powers of creativity, our powers of mental causation, our powers of generativity, as above, so below, the realization of oneself as a being who possesses creative attributes may be the one quality of life that is free from polarity.
So it's interesting. We're going all over the place here, and we were mentioned Spider-Man earlier, but I'm actually going to go Luke Skywalker on us here, which is a lot of the things that you just suggested, the smoking and other addictions and things of this sort, all have to do with getting a dopamine rush. Mm-hmm. And there is a perceived sense of power in that rush. Now, can we succeed in life? I want to talk about succeeding in life without selling out. Can we succeed in life without getting that rush, without going to the dark side, where maybe we feel like we're actually getting a more immediate sense of success?
Well, that's a good question, Michael, and I ask that question of myself. I get that dopamine rush in several ways. One of the ways I get the dopamine hit is frankly through social media, seeing whether people have commented on or liked my posts on Instagram, which I just joined, Twitter, Facebook. I'm very attached to it. And I have to be frank with myself about that. And if I'm not frank with you and your listeners about it, then I'm concealing something from your community. And what would be the point of our discussions if not to be open? And I get a dopamine rush that way. It's certainly not the only way. I suppose I ask myself, what's the cost of it? What's the harm? Am I neglecting relationships? I probably am experiencing some form of automatism, if not addiction. As long as that automatism isn't contributing to my neglect of others, I suppose it's a price I'm willing to pay.
Well, it's a choice, and I struggle with social media. We're getting better at it, and I have my Patreon page where I share personal stuff on a daily page with people. That's kind of our crowdfunding site, which is, I'll shamelessly say, Patreon, patreon.com/InspireNation. But on all the other ones, I struggle because I find myself falling into the, I want another like. And
I know.
When I do that, when I catch that addictive tendency, I snap back. But what you're saying right here is we get to make a choice. And if I'm saying I am choosing this attachment for my highest good, for the highest good of all, could be a slippery slope. It's interesting. But there's a different tenor to it if it's a conscious choice.
Well, I'm not sure I could claim credit for it being a conscious choice. It is an automatism on my part, and it would be self-inflated of me to say that I'm consciously choosing it, but I suppose it's a guilty pleasure that I tolerate because, let's face it, it does build my career to some extent. It does help expose some people to my books. People do experience a certain pleasure dialoguing with an author whose work that they like, as much as I experience a pleasure dialoguing with audience members who dig my stuff. And I suppose I look at that and I say that the opposing polarity that's implicit here, which is I have a dependency on this stuff, is tolerable. It's tolerable. Even if I can't claim that it's a consciously aware decision, I am aware to some degree of the consequence and I accept it. Look, I think we probably must have some entertainment in life, some kind of escapism, whatever it may be. For some of us, that's social drinking. For some of us, that's a certain kind of binge watching. For some of us, it may involve something else. I do think probably humanity has a need individually and collectively to zone out sometimes. I don't think I've encountered many exceptions to that on the road of life. People talk exceptions, but in terms of the period of time that an individual is awake for, probably there are needed escape valves from stress that are not only meditative, but are in some cases entertainment oriented. So I don't think that we can always put a finger on some behavior that doesn't necessarily appear productive, whether it be the donut or the chips or something else, and say, gee, I got to get away from that. The fact is, in the Noah's Ark parable, after Noah touched land, he planted a vineyard, harvested wine, and got drunk. So I think that this is probably a universal trait of human nature. We do need to zone out sometimes. There's probably a therapeutic necessity there.
I like it. I think that would be a fun one, a fun rabbit hole to go down, because even in days before technology, just sit on the tree. Hey, you've got the apple falling. Here's Newton and gravity in theory, but you're kicking
back. And I suspect
back.
our ancient ancestors, they understood fermentation. They understood the harvesting of tobacco, and they had their pleasures. These things have been around a long time.
So let's go from there, and let's talk about selling our souls and success. And first and foremost, why do we feel so many of our leaders today have forgotten how to succeed with honor?
Well, that's a prime problem that exists in our culture today, and it's come into blunter focus than it has any other period during my lifetime. That's a personal point of view, but I think it's very grave and very serious. I was just thinking before we got on this call together how I know people who I love and who I respect and who I support and for whom I wish good things, who support the current political system, which I think is hollowed out by utter cynicism and incompetence and corruption. And I don't understand them. I don't know what need that fills in their lives. They might look at me, by the way, and say, Mitch is exactly the same way. They might feel that the material that we were talking about earlier reflects some gap in my understanding, gap in my sensitivity, gap in my completeness. So I'm sure they have their own critique. But I I think that this all ties in, Michael, to a theme that has woven through our show today, which is why do we pursue a false feeling of life?
Yeah.
What does that mean? What does that substitute for? What cost does that exact from us? And that's probably the sub theme to our discussion. Why do we talk ideals but behave corruptly, broadly defined? And that is part of the human problem. That's part of the human situation. If we were capable of living up to ideals that we identify as good ideals, everything would be just fine in the world. We'd be living by these different codes that we talk about, whether it be the Bhagavad Gita or the Gospels or the work of Nietzsche or whatever your ethical path is, would be a lived one rather than just a curtain. And right now, these things are curtains. And what is it within human nature that allows us to simultaneously identify a code of honor and not live by it? And we don't see it. We're blocked from seeing it, which is why I was saying that my code of conduct has to be evaluated by other people who are directly around me because I can't see it myself. I can't read Satan's Honor Roll or another article and tell you, yes, I'm living by this. Tell your listeners, yes, I'm living by this. People who are close to me have to make that measurement. It doesn't fall to me to make it because I haven't sufficient clarity. That's part of the human situation. We talk ethics, we don't live them, and we're incapable of seeing that. That is part of the conundrum that we live under, it seems to me.
Thank you. So one or two more questions, then I want to dive into each of these. So what occurs to me when I look at leadership, when I look at the political theater, any of these things, what I realize is, to me, that's a microcosm, or it's actually a macrocosm of what's going on in the inside of us. That there is
Absolutely,
one
without
human
question.
beingness, and this human
Absolutely.
beingness is struggling.
Absolutely, absolutely. The Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, who brought transcendental meditation to the West, he would always observe, as have others, that leadership is merely a reflection of the body politic. It's nothing more. And so if we have leadership that we don't like, some of us individually object, but there's no question that it's a reflection of the body politic. And so it has to say something about the hive, and the hive is composed of its individual members. I can't just fully, totally, and completely wash my hands of it. I mean, even if one disdains the current political leadership, we follow the news with a sort of salacious thrill. We have to admit that to ourselves. What did he say now? What did he tweet this time? And he knows that, however, implicitly. And so I wake up in the morning and I talk about a dopamine hit. I derive my own salacious thrill from saying, what now? What next? And everybody does this, whatever they say that their politics are. So there is a symbiosis present, even when we claim, oh man, my fingerprints aren't on any of this. All of our fingerprints are.
So what is it that you feel? And then we're going to dive into the list. What is it? To me, all of this coming out now, it's just occurring to me, there's something repressed. There's something we're pushing down. Maybe it is our lack of feeling and ability to generate. But what is it that is squashing down, that is coming out? It's like acne on the face, but it's volcanoes coming up around the world because something has been squished.
It may be human nature in the sense that I say this with a heavy heart, but we do, as a culture and as individuals, derive pleasure from violence. If that weren't true, there wouldn't be any violent movies. There wouldn't be all these war games. There wouldn't be all these violent video games. And I'm not a gamer, but my kids are. And I don't think they're individuals who would commit any kind of cruel or wanton act of violence, but they derive a great deal of pleasure from these violent video games, as I did when I was a kid, using whatever the 2.0 version that existed back in the Stone Age.
Violence and
And
Pong.
yeah, right, violence and Pong, and there were. And look, it's all around us. We do derive a thrill from this. It's very often visceral, but it's not, or vicarious. I'm sorry, but it's not. It doesn't always indicate that the individual would heighten it to the level of physical violence, but it always has existed as a kind of entertainment. It populates our myths, our stories, our parables. And I do think that people derive a terrible thrill from seeing others humiliated, from watching reality television shows, which are really largely dedicated to gossip and outbreaks of verbal or sometimes physical violence. There's something in human nature that derives a thrill from friction and conflict. I am not sure whether that's a problem to be solved or an aspect of our existence to be managed, because it has always existed and it is universal. And I think we need to watch for it very carefully, because like all these other things that we've been discussing, it can envelop a person's entire life to the point where the dopamine rush that comes from the video game or the reality television show or the craps table or whatever can become altogether overwhelming. Maybe it's just a primal challenge of human nature.
It's fascinating because you've got me going here. I'm wanting to get to this list, but I'm thinking from a spiritual perspective. I believe we are love. We came from love. We couldn't be anything other than love. But then we are given collective amnesia. We're put into this meat suit and we're given specific challenges, survival being one of them, which isn't to me survival of the fittest, but certainly in some origin story of the human species, there was a competition, you versus me, whereas now we get to go to a place of co-opetition, all of us together, because we're in a closed planet, a closed loop. There's only so many resources to go about. And so how do we go maybe from this original nature of struggling to survive to something else?
Well, it's interesting. It could be that sentience involves friction, which doesn't contradict what you're saying about the source of creativity, but it could be that friction is the price we pay for sentience. We see that in the story of Prometheus, who gets punished for stealing fire from the gods. We see that in the story of Eve and the serpent in Genesis 3, who gets expelled from paradise for eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So it could be that to exist as sentient beings means to be in some kind of a friction, but that doesn't contradict the creative source from which we arise.
Beautiful. All right, so let's go into some of these beautiful tenets here having to do with a noble path. First off, loyalty, something that seems incredibly missing today.
Profoundly missing. It is the great lost virtue of our time. And I must say right off, loyalty is not the same thing as corruption. You don't show loyalty to somebody who's performing acts of violence, which is to say somebody who's violating the ability of other people to express their own highest potential. Corruption and loyalty are not synonymous. Being loyal to an individual.
I want to pause you there because that is so huge, because some people might think loyalty and then think something mafia-esque, for instance, that is loyalty.
Exactly. One mustn't conflate loyalty with corruption. To be loyal towards the corrupt is to collude. To be loyal means to honor the individual in a solidaristic sense, where you also know how to say no.
Beautiful. Sincerity.
Simple truth-telling. And this too comes with a caveat and a warning. A great teacher of mine once said, don't be stupidly sincere. Sincerity doesn't mean just hurting a person and then hiding behind the excuse, but it's true. I'm not permitted. Well, I'm permitted to do anything I want, but I can't honor behavior that says, like, gee, I think, your car is ugly, or, that's a silly looking hat, or whatever it may be. that's being stupidly sincere. The point of sincerity is not to humiliate, alienate, or excuse yourself for making demeaning comments. The point is to speak the truth in a manner that's intelligent.
Thank you, because it comes right back to your flagging down somebody in the snow litmus test, which is if we go
Exactly.
old school Jerry Maguire, if anybody remembers that with Tom Cruise and getting kneed in the you know where by his then fiance or no longer fiance at that point, and she was saying we committed to brutal honesty, and she would emphasize the word brutal. That's
Hmm.
not what we're talking about.
Correct. Yes, right on.
So let's go to reliability.
Reliability, another truly lost art. Being reliable not only means keeping your word and showing up, but it means having a sense of scale about these things. There are people who will cancel dates on you just because they have an errand to run. And cancellation is okay sometimes, but it should only be when there's an urgent matter at hand. Just having the sniffles or just needing to run an errand is not, to my mind, sufficient cause for cancellation. It's important to respect other people's time and integrity as well. I have a friend who puts it this way: the only true emergency is a medical emergency. Short of that, there aren't very many good reasons for not coming through for somebody. I think that reliability, like loyalty, is a lost virtue.
And when you say lost, it actually seems to me to be something of the technology age. In not too long ago, you could ring somebody up, but there's a very good chance you wouldn't even catch them. But there was a closeness of then getting together rather than to breaking each of these engagements with a simple "can't make it" pew of your
Right.
text.
It's very important for people to understand that others are very affected by my latenesses or my cancellation. And unless there's a really solid and sound reason for it, which once in a while there is, it's something that should be taken very seriously. We don't often understand the degree to which others are affected by our own sense of reliability. And it's cumulative, and eventually, whether it's fair or not, an individual will be judged for it and will be judged starkly.
And since you say cumulative, I look at it as kind of karma points, which brings us to the next one, honor. When we act with honor, I think we attract more of that goodness into our lives. When we are not
Absolutely.
acting honorable, we're attracting that as well.
Without question. I think honor means really making a strenuous effort to square your life with the code that you have declared fealty to. And I'm using hot button language because some people are going to object and say, there's too much effort in what you're talking about. There's too much pushing and pulling. And they may have a good point. They may have a good point. Um, and I'll look at that. But I honestly think that honor means the willingness to sacrifice comfort for ideals.
Now, it may come from the Course of Miracles. That might be the origin of what I've got. It's a question that I continuously ask, and it might be a way that we can answer a lot of these questions without feeling like we're working too hard. What would love do?
Oh, great. Brilliant. Brilliant.
Because that at the end of the day, oh, I'm just going to cancel on the person. What would love do? I'm going to talk
Right.
about them behind their back. What would love do? I'm getting on social media. What
Hmm.
would love do? In fact, you have
Yes.
something brilliant in one of your articles. Is being a smartass a sign of cowardice?
Without question, it is. And we do it all the time on social media because it allows us plausible deniability. It allows us to say something that's often denigrating or hostile or disputatious, couched in a joke, couched in a moment of humorous sarcasm. It's the opposite of disclosure, it's the opposite of sincerity. Smartasses are cowards. Mm.
Uh, there was in my head, I'm going in an eternal loop. Smartasses are cowards, and if we call smartasses cowards, then we're being cowards for being smartass. About being cowards, I apologize.
It's
we're
okay.
we're going down a spiral. Talk to me about trust, and it's interesting. Just as a tangent, and we're gonna get there in a minute. All of these, all of these ways of bringing nobility to our lives, I believe help us to become more of a success. We're talking about selling out and not being able to find success without selling out. But if we do these things, I believe, like Paul Selig talks about with his guides, we are going to the higher room. We are choosing a much
Hmm.
nobler path that attracts greatness into our lives.
I agree with that. And some people might ask the question, what does it mean to sell out? What is it you guys are really talking about? My personal definition, which I explore in The Miracle of a Definite Chief Aim, is selling out means putting money before quality, putting money before quality. That's it. And if you look at different artists, craftspeople, media folk, entrepreneurs, as long as they're not sacrificing the quality of their end product for money and thus disabling their relationship with the user, they're not selling out. Selling out isn't success. Selling out is subverting quality. As long as you're not subverting quality in exchange for resources, I don't think you ever have to worry about the question of selling out.
My guess is you have a lot of stories about bands rattling around in that brain of yours, about bands that you absolutely loved, and then you were like, what in the world? And other bands who stayed true to their course throughout their entire existence.
Oh, sure. And sometimes it goes in phases. Sometimes a band or an artist, first of all, sometimes they make an effort to sell out and they fail. And I always tell people there's nothing worse than trying to sell out
Oh,
and
no.
failing. I used to see that in publishing where people would produce something that was really awful. And I was like, oh my God, that's like trying to sell out and failing. And then sometimes people try to sell out and they succeed. But then maybe they may come back closer to the source of what they're about. I've seen that in artists I admire. So it's not as if any of this is a door that only revolves in one direction. There's always the possibility for return if somebody does something that they feel didn't reflect their best.
I see a lot of people hitting glass ceilings, particularly people who consider themselves spiritual, where they keep on pinging off of the ceiling, which I believe is self-imposed. It's in the subconscious. And I'm wondering, for instance, a lot of people on some level feel like, well, as it goes, money is the root of all evil. And therefore, if that's running around in their subconscious, they have a really hard time becoming abundant, no matter how many The Secrets or anything of the sort they watch. And I'm wondering, talking about this topic today, how much we have rooted in our psyche, maybe since childhood, for many of us, not all of us. It really depends on the childhood that you had, that
Hmm.
if you are successful, you are selling out. Therefore, I will chop you off at the knees each time you get close to achieving your greatness.
I think that's a really important observation. And I really do believe until maybe about 7 or 8 years ago in my life, I was laboring under that same illusion. I I wasn't conscious of it, but I thought of money as being something that was sullied, dirty, wrong, a marker of something that I didn't like. And it was only in the last few years of my publishing career that I was finally able to step up and say, oh, this is the compensation I deserve for the billing that I've brought in, for the value that I've brought in. For a long time, I could not do that. So I would just accept whatever was given. But at a certain point, I realized that I was bringing in a level of billing that wasn't commensurate with my compensation. And I was finally able to say something, write a memo, make the point, and the outcome was really good and positive. And I would encourage your listeners, don't skip past that point that Michael just made, because a lot of us might think, I'm fine with money. I'm good. I don't harbor that attitude. Peel back the onion, spend a little time with that. You won't regret it, because some of us may harbor those attitudes without knowing it, as I did.
There's a movie I have not seen. Several guests have mentioned it. I try to stay on the, I really want to be careful what I put into my mind so that that's what I'm working on. But I'm guessing I have to go and watch Meryl Streep's The Laundromat one of these days.
I've never seen it, so we'll watch it together.
Excellent, excellent. All right, let's
Yeah.
go from there. Let's go to trust.
Trust is just really being a resource for people that they can believe in,
Mhm.
that they understand, that they know if I make a citation, I have researched that citation, that they know if I make a claim, I'm not relying on hyperbole, that they know if I tell a story about myself, that story really happened. They're being a resource of integrity for people in your words, in your work, in your products, in your citations, that's trust. Are you a viable resource?
I'm going back to Jerry Maguire and somebody who shook his hand and said, "My word is gold."
I remember that like it was yesterday, Michael. I remember that scene, and it haunted me because Jerry, the protagonist in the movie, was attempting to make a deal with the dad of a particular athlete. And Jerry brings up having a contract, having an agreement. And the man says to him, "We don't need an agreement. Where I come from, we go on a handshake. And as you said, my word is gold. My word is as strong as oak." He's the first person to reverse himself and to rip off Jerry when the weather gets rough. Now, I'm not saying that that doesn't mean that people should be able to rely on a handshake. I've had lawyers make the point to me that a handshake is more valuable than a contract because all a contract can do is mitigate loss. And if you're turning to the contract, you're already in trouble. You're already, your dial is on red. A contract can mitigate loss, but it can't make somebody keep their word. And a lawyer made the point to me that your sense of trust in another individual is worth more than a piece of paper, no matter how much time and energy you've been put into that piece of paper. But that movie is showing us how some people who talk the loudest about their own nobility are the ones possessed of the least trust. The Talmud says, "Beware a man who bespeaks his own virtue. Beware a man who bespeaks his own virtue." We have to be careful of that in ourselves.
I love that you say in ourselves, because first off, I'm thinking about how much differently we would hold ourselves, we would carry ourselves, how we would act if we felt my word is good as gold. The second piece of it, though, is we have to look at our own individual lives. Are we keeping our word to ourselves? Because if we're not, on the little things, forget about the big things. If we're not keeping our word to ourselves on the little things, then we have no trust in ourselves, and then we have no trust in the world.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We only see things in others that we harbor within ourselves. And that's why, if we feel misunderstood by another person, for example, it's important to realize that we may indeed be misunderstood, but we're being misunderstood not because of some deficit in us, not because of my inability or your inability to explain something or to make ourselves heard, but the other individual might not embody those same values, and we tend to project onto others the values that we embody, which is also why it's very important to be around people, to be working with people who are receptive to what you're trying to accomplish, who understand what you're about. Because if you feel that a coworker or a neighbor or a collaborator or a family member doesn't get you, I would probably say the fault is not within you. It's not that you fail to properly enunciate what you're about, but it's just that person has a different orientation, and that person might not have the trait within him or herself that you are embodying, hence they can't see it. We see ourselves wherever we go.
And speaking of seeing, can you tell us about foresight?
Foresight is understanding the consequences of one's actions. And that is a foundation of wisdom, understanding the consequences of one's actions. Whatever I do, I'm going to have to live with. And very often people say to me, "Hey, all this mind metaphysics stuff that you do, this mind causation, it's kind of fearsome because if a bad person is using this stuff, it can outpicture in a tremendous degree of violence in the world." And I acknowledge that. But the truth is, we face ethical decisions every day. We face ethical decisions when we do our taxes, when we get behind the wheel of a car, when we take out a credit card. All these things have ethical consequences and possibilities attached to them. Foresight simply means awareness of one's consequences or the potential consequences. Even if we haven't the perspective to know what the consequences are, at least know that they're there. At least know that they're there. Matching action with consequence is one of the foundations of wisdom.
Thank you. Who's Mr. A?
Oh, Mr. A. Well, I have a tattoo on my arm here. It's going to be upside down, but it says A is A. That was a formula that was used by Socrates, later popularized by others. Mr. A is a character that was created by the comic book artist, great illustrator Steve Ditko, who died about 1 year ago. And although I never knew Steve, very few people did because he was kind of a shut-in and he was deeply private. Maybe shut-in is not a fair description. He was a deeply private man, but he was the creator or co-creator of figures like Doctor Strange, Spider-Man, and Mr. A was a hero, an objectivist hero that Steve had created in the latter part of his career. And Steve reached a place in his own work as an artist where he felt he didn't want to compromise with the tastes or the needs of the market. It's interesting because Steve was a follower of the objectivist philosopher Ayn Rand. And even though everybody thinks of Ayn as being this hyper-driven capitalist, capitalism is not necessarily intrinsic to her work in such a way that says you have to follow the demands or needs of commerce, of what people want. In some regards, it's quite the opposite. And Steve's understanding was a pure, true understanding, which is, yes, we're all involved in commerce, but that gives us this kind of extremist self-responsibility of what we wish to cooperate with or do not wish to cooperate with. Steve no longer wished to cooperate with the mass marketing of superheroes. He wanted to create characters like Mr. A, who's a very objectivist, very hyper-rational hero that had nowhere near the mass appeal of Spider-Man and Doctor Strange. And as a result of Steve's decision, he lived a life that was very ascetic. He didn't have much money, and he could have gotten huge paydays from Hollywood for the Spider-Man and Doctor Strange movies. And according to what I've heard, which I have to acknowledge is hearsay because I didn't know Steve personally, but he turned down paydays from those movies because they just didn't square with his values or what he wanted to express as an artist. So Steve is a great hero to me because he chose his own path and accepted the consequences without complaint. He did what he did as an artist, striking out an independent path that was not remunerative at all, but he chose that path of integrity without complaint. I might say this in the article, and I'll repeat it here. Don't be a hero after you cash the check. Too many people cash checks from movie studios, and then they complain about the treatment of the character, or about the casting, or about how their original vision got mixed up by an egg beater. Well, that's part of what you're being paid for to a certain extent. You've just licensed your creation to somebody else. You've sold your creation to somebody else. You don't have to do that. But if you do that, then you have no say. I have no say over what somebody does in my rental home unless I've laid down stipulations about it. So don't be a hero after you cash the check. Steve was a hero before cashing the check. And for that reason, he cashed fewer checks. But he died a hero, in my estimation.
Which, if we bring it full circle to kind of wrap things up here today, and we go to your book, The Miracle of a Definite Chief Aim, there were probably many publishers that you could have gone with in this industry, but you didn't want to cash the check and then have your book changed. Instead, and this wasn't dying a pauper, you had a strong vision and you knew there was a positive energy to it. It was important. You held in there.
Absolutely, and that is true. And I'll tell a story about something that happened with my book, The Miracle Club. And this is dead to rights, the facts of what occurred. The Miracle Club was under option to a very, very large publisher. I submitted the book in its finished manuscript form, and the editor who reviewed it told me that he wanted me to make changes. He didn't want me to use the term New Thought, which he thought was too subculture a term, too metaphysical a term. He wanted me to organize it according to 9 principles, make all kinds of changes. And I had submitted a finished manuscript that I felt was complete, was perfect, was brought to just a razor's edge of where I wanted it to be. And I said, no thanks. And I went to another much smaller publisher that paid me much less and published the book exactly as it is. And I said to these guys, you can go through and copy edit it only to correct grammar and usage, but I'm uncompromising on anything that I've written because I felt I had really put the time and energy in. And I've also been through the experience of copy editors at mainstream houses just cutting things to ribbons for no good reason, asking superfluous questions, making changes that are just altering language without strengthening clarity, which to me violates the first rule of writing. So anyway, I went to a house that paid me less, and they published it the way I wanted it published. And I might add, the book is selling very, very well. I just received a large royalty check, which I'm happy about. So, right, there aren't many royalty checks popping around publishing. So it was a happy story for everybody. And I did make the sacrifice of what would have been a larger advance for sticking with the vision.
So, it's interesting in the publishing industry, the advances have gotten much smaller these days. It could be paid up front, a little paid up front, or hang in there for your vision and maybe more paid in the long run.
The latter has personally been more satisfying to me. The former has its purposes. I mean, there are writers for whom large advances are very, very important, and there are good reasons for that. But you have to weigh it out. You have to realize you are trading something off in either case.
Yeah. So where can people go to find your books and find out more, Mitch?
Well, my website is mitchhorowitz.com. There's some new videos, new material up there. I am finally on Instagram. I have been dragged into the 21st century, and I'm on Instagram at Mitch Horowitz 23, numeral 23, Mitch Horowitz 23. And you can throw my name in.
I love it. I've got to pause you on the number. Very, very cool, Mitch.
You get it. You get it. Thank you. And you can find my books just about any place. If you throw my name into Amazon or Google, it'll take you to all my books.
So,
yeah.
What one piece of wisdom do you want to give people that they can start to take action on today to make honorable choices so that at night when they go to sleep and their head hits the pillow, they feel like they're taking an honorable path and are not a sellout themselves?
Well, it's said that the best form of instruction is by example. So in hopes that I'm responding to your question, let me offer an action rather than a principle. And that action is I want to express my very, very deep gratitude to you and to the Inspire Nation listeners and viewers for hanging with us all this time and through this show, because I realize that this episode has been dedicated to some very unconventional material. This hasn't necessarily followed any of the usual guideposts or trailblazers. And I want to extend a very deep thanks to you, Michael, and to the Inspire Nation viewers and listeners for hanging with us through what has been a very unconventional exchange. And it gives me the opportunity to speak to your listeners about some different kinds of ideas. And as I speak about these ideas, I come to new perspectives on them myself. So we're all seeking together. And I want to extend my thanks to the Inspire Nation family.
Woohoo! And I will extend it to them as well, because it would be easy to just do law of attraction, 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 law of attraction. But at the end of the day, is that really teaching us a better, more noble, more cooperative way to live?
Yeah. Let us search together. Let's search together. Yeah.
Excellent. So for everyone out there, this is Michael Sandler saying, be well, have fun, get the miracle of a definite chief aim, and begin discovering success with honor today, and shine bright. Woohoo!
All right. Thank you.
You did it again,
Pleasure.
Mitch. You absolutely did it again.
That was an edgy show. We're going to get some YouTube comments, but that's great. I really appreciate it. And that was hilarious, what you're saying at the end. Of course, we could do law of attraction, but that was a really edgy show. I thought that was terrific. Thanks for, being open about all those subjects.
You're most welcome. Thanks for writing them. And I was going with Jessica beforehand. I'm going, how do I thread this needle? How do I thread this needle? How do I? And at the end of the day, it's let go, let it thread.
Yeah, right. That was a pleasure. I really enjoyed it. Thank you, man.
I just had the most beautiful roller coaster of a ride with Mitch Horowitz. To check out more incredible videos by Mitch and myself, click here, subscribe below.